Welcome, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to The Muddy York. We've got a great episode today. Adam, how are you doing?
I'm okay this morning. How are you doing, new father and all?
I'm great. Not getting a lot of sleep. And if you hear a little crying in the back room, it's the latest podcast member. But we'll try to do this quick. He's down for a nap. Let's get into it. What do we have for today?
Today we are talking about Ambrose Small. Now, you're all listening to this on December 5th. I know that because that's when we released the episode, and I'm sure none of you could wait even a single day to hear what we had to say. But you did miss an anniversary 3 days ago. You see, December 2nd was the anniversary of a major incident in Toronto history. People were scandalized by it. It dominated the press for years. But time passes, and pretty soon we all forgot. This episode of Muddy York is about the disappearance of Ambrose Small. On December 1st, 1919, Ambrose Small sold his business, a theatrical empire spanning Ontario, and deposited a check for $1 million, worth at least $15 million today. The next day, he disappeared and was never seen again. Over the next decade, Toronto would become obsessed with the disappearance of Ambrose Small. Was he alive or dead? If he was alive, where was he? If he was dead, who had killed him and why?
Newspapers from all over North America reported on the mysterious disappearance of the Toronto millionaire. Local papers were enthusiastic promoters of the story, printing all sorts of theories about Small's fate. His wife killed him because he was planning to leave her for his mistress. No, his mistress killed him because he wouldn't leave his wife. He was buried in the basement of his mansion. No, he was buried in Rosedale Ravine. No, he was still alive and living in Mexico. After his wife offered $50,000 reward for his return, the theories became even more outlandish, and grifters from all over the world showed up proclaiming that they had solved the mystery and would be happy to tell you about it as soon as you loan them some money to cover their expenses, of course.
Today on Muddy York, we will tell the story of how Ambrose Small became Toronto's leading impresario and how his disappearance captivated the city during the Roaring '20s. I had first heard about Ambrose Small from In the Skin of a Lion, Michael Ondaatje's great novel written by Michael Ondaatje about Toronto during the '20s. But this is the first time that I had a chance to really dig into the story of his disappearance and the media circus that followed. But let's start with the man himself. Peter Ambrose Joseph Small was born in Bradford, Ontario in the winter of 1866. His family was Catholic, which was important because Toronto was a staunchly Protestant city, and his family moved to Toronto when he was 8. But the most important event in his life came 6 years later, when his father took over a hotel and bar at the corner of Adelaide and Bay. Right next door was the Grand Opera House, the one true love of Ambrose Small's life. The Grand Opera House was the finest theater in Toronto. It hosted some of the most famous performers of the age, like Sarah Bernhardt and Oscar Wilde. We have some pictures on the Twitter and Facebook pages, and you can see that it was an impressive building for its time. It had actually burned down the previous year and had been rebuilt in just 51 days.
These days, it would take that long just to fill out the permit forms. Small started working there as an usher, but he didn't just show people to their seats. He also was a bartender and ran his own bookmaking operation, taking bets on horse races. By the time he turned 18, he was the theater's assistant treasurer. 5 years later, he would be fired after an argument with his boss, so he took a job with the new Toronto Opera House located right down the street. Just to clarify, calling something an opera house conjures up images of fancy buildings like the Four Seasons Centers. But these were just ordinary theaters. The Toronto Opera House was actually a converted roller rink. His new theater didn't aim for the upper-class audiences that went to the Grand Opera House, and that suited Small perfectly. He didn't believe in staging Shakespeare performances for the great and the good. His theater specialized in popular entertainment like vaudeville, melodramas, and musicals. A menu of sobs and villainy, as one person described it. And we know he was good at his job because within 3 years, he'd gone from the treasurer to the manager to buying the mortgage for the theater. He would also develop a notorious reputation. If you wanted to be generous, you would say that he was a hard-nosed businessman and a tough negotiator. If not, you would say that he was a crook who would lie and cheat whenever he got the chance. Traveling show managers learned that they had to get their share of the box office on the night of the show because some of it was likely to be gone by the next morning.
In 1902, he married Teresa Corman. Teresa's family owned a brewery in Toronto. More interestingly, she was actually his stepmother's younger sister.
Oh, that's pretty kinky.
It's a bit unusual, even for those times. The two had very different personalities. Teresa was prim, proper, and devoutly Catholic. You can see a picture of her on our Twitter feed, and she looks exactly like the respectable society lady that she was. For his part, Ambrose loved drinking, gambling, and philandering. His affairs with actresses and chorus girls were an open secret. Later on, Ambrose would use Teresa's money to purchase his first love, the Grand Opera House. It promptly became the headquarters of his growing theatrical empire. While Teresa was traveling in Europe, he added a secret room to the building, built for his assorted affairs, complete with an oriental rug, a well-appointed bar, a painting of a nude woman, and an opulent bed. Over the next 20 years, he would progressively buy, build, or lease dozens of theaters in cities and towns throughout Ontario and the neighboring states. This was important because it meant that he could run his own theatrical circuit. In those days, only a handful of cities, like London or New York, were big enough to support a show for any period of time. An extended theatrical run, like the one that Hamilton just had in Toronto, was impossible. There just weren't enough people to attend all the shows. That meant that if a theatrical troupe wanted to make money, they had to keep moving from town to town. Ambrose could offer them guaranteed bookings in dozens of theaters across Ontario, and all he wanted in return was 30% of their ticket sales. Sometimes he would draw up a contract with an even higher percentage. If someone noticed, he would summon his assistant into the room and yell at him for the supposed mistake.
Hoo-hoo. Interesting business practices. However, in 1919, Small decided to sell his entire business. World War I had been hard on the economy, and Spanish flu had scared audiences away from the theaters.
That's something we can all understand today.
Yeah. Production costs were rising. Touring theater shows were being replaced by something new called moving pictures, and his theaters were starting to look a little tired. So Ambrose agreed to sell everything for $1.75 million, $1 million in cash upfront and $750,000 in stock to be paid over the next 20 years. At a time when most people were lucky to make $30 a week, this deal would have made him one of the richest men in Canada. On December 1st, he met his buyers to sign the contracts and received his $1 million check. There was a brief delay because, unbeknownst to Ambrose, Teresa had to approve the deal. Ontario had passed a Dower Act at a time when a married couple's property was held in the husband's name. The act was designed to protect women from being forced out of their homes. If the husband wanted to sell family real estate, his wife had to approve the sale. Teresa would agree to waive her dower rights, but the terms that Ambrose had agreed to would become a significant issue. Ambrose got his check and deposited it into his personal savings account. Notably, he didn't deposit it into the joint account from which he and Teresa could both withdraw money. Teresa would later say that she had deposited the check, but an OPP report confirmed that it was Ambrose. The next day, he was still working at the Grand Opera House. He got to keep his office as part of the deal. At 5 p.m., his lawyer came by to pick up his payment for negotiating the deal. Ambrose invited him to dinner, but the lawyer had a train to catch and he declined. At 5:30 p.m., he left the office. This was the last confirmed sighting of Ambrose Small.
At first, nobody reported his disappearance. Ambrose was famous for taking off without warning. He was probably at the track or romancing his latest mistress. But by the end of the month, his friends were becoming worried. Teresa told them she didn't want to report his disappearance to the police because she feared a scandal. "I believe my Amby is in the hands of a designing woman somewhere and will come back."
That was pretty bad, but I appreciate the effort.
Well, you gotta try. However, it seemed unlikely that Ambrose would have disappeared on his own because he hadn't taken any of the gigantic payday that he had just received. On January 3rd, that's almost a month later, more than a month later, Torontonians awoke to headlines reporting, "The startling disappearance of Toronto millionaire causes grave apprehension." Other newspapers across North America quickly picked up on the story. Now, who knows why one story or one crime catches the public imagination? 30 years ago, we became obsessed with the trial of a retired football player accused of killing his wife. In 1920, the people of North America became obsessed with the disappearance of Ambrose Small. Initially, Teresa offered a $500 reward for information leading to Ambrose's return. Later, she upped it to $50,000 if he was found alive and $15,000 if he was found dead. This was the largest reward that had ever been offered in Canada, and it opened the floodgates. Newspapers reported sightings in dozens of different cities. Amateur detectives started prowling back lanes and ravines looking for a body. Any unidentified body prompted speculation. People came forward claiming that they were Ambrose. Their lack of physical resemblance was explained as the effects of an accident or torture. Spiritualism was all the rage in those days, and one woman claimed that if you burned a photograph of Ambrose with a powder that only she could provide, the smoke would point the way to his body. In another case, a Viennese hypnotist claimed that he could find the body using psychic thought waves. I know you'll be shocked to learn that he was actually a con man with outstanding warrants for fraud. The world is a very strange place. Who would have thought that Viennese hypnotists might not be all that they claimed? When the police began their own investigation, one of the first things they did was to visit Ambrose's office at the Grand Opera House. When they arrived, there was evidence of a confrontation. The leg of his rolling chair had been broken. The telephone was ripped off the wall, and there were cigarette butts on the floor, even though he didn't smoke. Initially, they thought it might be a case of kidnapping, but no ransom demand was ever made.
Attention quickly focused on Jack Dowdy, Ambrose's right-hand man. As Small grew wealthy, Dowdy didn't think that he was getting his fair share of the riches. Dowdy began talking to people about various schemes to get money out of Ambrose and even talked about kidnapping him. A witness reported seeing Dowdy on the private stairs outside Ambrose's office on the evening of December 2nd. Plus, Dowdy himself had been missing in action since the end of December. Finally, when a safecracker was hired to open Small's safe deposit box, victory bonds worth $105,000, more than $1.5 million in today's money, were missing. Teresa didn't have access to the vault. Dowdy did. His flight only added to the media hoopla. Now, reports were looking for a missing millionaire and a fugitive on the run with a fortune in war bonds. In November, Dowdy would be arrested in Oregon and brought back to Toronto. Thousands of people gathered to get a look as he was marched into police headquarters. The victory bonds were hidden at his brother's house, and Dowdy claimed that he had taken them as part of a play for a bonus. He said that if he personally delivered them, he was hoping that Ambrose might give him some as a reward for long service. It doesn't sound like something that Small would have done, but that was Dowdy's story. He was tried and convicted for the theft of the bond, but while the prosecution repeatedly implied that Dowdy was responsible for Ambrose's disappearance, they couldn't produce any evidence to that effect. and Doughty was sentenced to 6 years in the Kingston Penitentiary.
With Doughty out of the picture, public attention started shifting towards Teresa. The people most responsible for that were Ambrose's sisters. His sisters were unmarried. At the time, they would have been called spinsters, and Ambrose supported them financially. After he disappeared, the money stopped. Initially, nobody could get access to his money because nobody knew if Ambrose was alive or dead. Eventually, Teresa was given access to his bank accounts under court supervision, but she refused to give the sisters any money. Whether because of this or some other reason, they became convinced that Teresa had killed their brother. Around this time, a man named Patrick Sullivan showed up on the scene. He was a former cop who had been fired because he was, quote, generally opposed to authority and discipline. When he arrived in Toronto, he offered his detective services to Teresa, but after she declined, he went to the sisters and became their fiercest advocate, along with something of a Svengali to them. Sullivan became editor of a tabloid called The Thunderer that specialized in lurid stories of crime, and it turned out that he was a good tabloid writer. He took the story of two frail sisters whose brother had promised to support them, but who were being left to live in poverty because their evil sister-in-law had stopped that support. As time passed, he claimed that the Catholic Church was involved in a cover-up to prevent the case from being solved. While all of the Smalls were Catholic, Teresa was especially devout and made large donations to various church causes. Plus, Catholic conspiracies were a great way to sell papers in Toronto. Finally, he would claim that Teresa had actually confessed to him that she had killed Ambrose and left a typewritten confession letter for his sisters. Curiously, Sullivan chose to keep this a secret for 7 years and didn't tell anyone until Teresa had died and the sisters were trying to challenge her will. The judge at the court hearing dismissed the letter as an obvious forgery.
Despite all of Sullivan's grandstanding, there were some interesting questions surrounding Teresa. As we mentioned, Teresa didn't report her husband missing because she said he was in the arms of some designing woman and she feared a scandal. She even told his friends not to go to the police when they became concerned. However, on the evening of his disappearance, Teresa had been racing around Toronto trying to find him. That night, she would visit her sister, her niece, the Grand Opera House, and the home of one of his confidants, a man named Thomas Flynn. Flynn's neighbors reported that she came by, quote, in a most excited state, looking for Flynn and asking to use their phone. Ambrose's father, who was married to Teresa's sister, said that she looked terrible when she arrived at their home. She stayed for more than an hour. Then, when the phone rang, she ran to it, listened for a minute, and then, without saying goodbye, rushed out the door and apparently went to her home. Teresa said that she was concerned when Ambrose didn't arrive home for dinner, but he was a well-known carouser, so why did this worry her so much? If she was concerned about his absence, why did she refuse to call the police? It was also worth returning to her decision to waive her dower rights. Remember, Ambrose couldn't sell his empire and receive his $1 million check until she agreed. In 1922, Teresa had presented a written agreement that entitled her to half of the $1 million check. She also claimed that Ambrose had promised her some victory bonds, although the amount would change over time. Ambrose had deposited the money into his personal savings account, to which she didn't have access. Was that just more convenient for bookkeeping, or was he planning to go back on his deal with Teresa? It wouldn't have been the first time that he did something like that.
Ambrose Small would be officially declared deceased in 1924, and the case would remain unsolved until it was officially closed in 1960. Jack Doughty was released from prison in 1926 and lived with his family until he suffered a stroke in 1949. In the face of tabloid reporters and society gossip, Teresa would become a recluse, and spend most of her time praying with the Sisters of Service, a new religious institute dedicated to building schools and providing social services in remote communities. Teresa would spend $25,000 to buy the mansion across the street from her home and give it to the Sisters of Service as a base for training new sisters. She died in 1935. The company that bought Ambrose's empire went broke within a few years. Since the owners wouldn't be making the $750,000 in stock payments that they owed, they returned the Grand Opera House to Teresa. Had he lived, Ambrose could have had the money and his beloved theater. But without him, it remained empty for the next few years before it was demolished in 1927. Scotia Plaza towers over Ambrose's old headquarters today, but the Grand Opera Lane, just off of Adelaide, is a reminder of what used to be. Ambrose Small would become part of Toronto folklore. For decades to come, anytime a building was demolished, people would ask if they had found his body. A hackneyed joke from the 20s would be to ask someone digging in their garden if they were looking for Ambrose Small. He became the Canadian version of Jimmy Hoffa. Michael Ondaatje would include a fictionalized version of Ambrose Small for In the Skin of a Lion. In the book, Ambrose says, "I'm a thief. All thieves plan their escape route." More recently, there was a play called Grand Ghosts, which was performed at the Grand Theatre in London, Ontario. Incidentally, the Grand Theatre is the last surviving theatre that Ambrose had owned. In a completely random encounter, one of the actors from that show stopped me on the subway because I was reading a book about Small and he wanted to know what I thought about the case.
So, what do you think about the case?
Well, I don't know what happened, but here's a few points. 1. I cannot believe that Ambrose Small disappeared on his own. This man loved notoriety and he loved money. To disappear with no cameras and no reporters and no action, there is no reason for him to do that. That was his life. And having just made the equivalent of $15 million, he didn't take a dime of it. That's just not something he would have done. So, he did not disappear of his own accord. Second, he had just deposited a check for $15 million, well, the equivalent of it. And the next day he disappears. I don't know about you, Gray. I find it hard to believe that that's a coincidence. Do you agree?
No, I totally agree. And I actually found this interesting because this was kind of like our first true crime episode within the Mighty York universe. Let's say that. So I enjoyed it. But if you had to guess, if you had to put your money on a suspect, who would you pick?
I'm going to say I don't know if Teresa did it, but she was definitely involved. So let's look at what she did the night he disappeared. Something happened, we don't know what, but it's so serious that she races around Toronto looking for Ambrose. She said he didn't show up for dinner, but he constantly did that. So something happened. Then she gets a call and leaves. So for her to not be involved, something happens that night that's so serious she has to race around the city. But it has nothing to do with his disappearance. And by the end of the evening, it's so settled, so complete, everything's put back in place, that when Ambrose doesn't show up for days to come, not only does she not call the police, she tells all of his friends not to call the police. Now, I don't know if she killed him, I don't know if she hired someone, but she knew something. Though what I can't say.
What benefit did she get out of it? Do you think she was just tired of his philandering and carousing?
I think it was the dower rights.
Right.
If he had promised her half the money to waive her dower rights, but then put all of the money into an account that she couldn't access, which is definitely the sort of thing he would do, she might have just decided enough was enough. She loved charitable giving. She gave away most of their money before she died on charitable giving. And she may have been imagining all of the things she could do with what was then $500,000 and is now about $7 or $8 million. And then she goes to the bank and she can't get to it. It's all in an account that Ambrose controls. And maybe he'll give it to her and maybe he won't. And she may have just decided that was the last straw.
Guys, what do you think? It's no small mystery. But that's about it for the episode. Adam, did you enjoy doing this kind of new realm of podcasting for us? I enjoyed it.
I enjoyed it, but there are a lot of true crime podcasts, so we'll only do this. Will be sort of an intermittent thing, just something to do to spice up Toronto history.
Oh, for sure. This is definitely not a Toronto true crime podcast, but some features here and there. Everybody loves true crime. It hits. It works.
So thank you for listening to this episode, and we will be back in 2 weeks. So have a good week, everyone.
Take care.